do.
Hello there, this is John Evans. Welcome to an episode here of Book and Spade, where I will be responding to a prompt for a class out of United Lutheran Seminary. It is a course that examines the Hebrew Bible, and one of the questions I've been given is about an article by Gary Anderson. His article is entitled, "What About the Canaanites?" and deals with the idea of Israel's nationhood and the conquest under Joshua. We might remember the famous spiritual song, "Joshua fought the battle of Jericho and the walls came tumbling down." Well, the prompt I've been asked to answer is Anderson's understanding of the biblical presentation of Israel's nationhood at odds with modern conception? Well, to answer this question, we must break down three components. What is Anderson's understanding of the so-called biblical presentation of Israel's nationhood? What do we mean by the biblical presentation of Israel's nationhood? And what do we mean by modern conceptions? Well, right off the bat, what is unique is Anderson provides his overall critique of the narrative given in Scripture. Genesis chapter 12 describes how Abram is called out of Ur of the Chaldees to leave his father's house and his father's people, to go to a new land, the land of Canaan. There he is to have many descendants, as numerous as the stars. This will eventually become the Jewish people through Isaac and through Jacob. And yet they are not necessarily the immediate owners of the land. They live among many other peoples, the peoples of the Canaanites. And we learn that it will only be after the people of Israel will go into captivity in Egypt for, there is some debate, but the traditional understanding is about 400 years. Will they then come back and repossess the land of Canaan? And this happens in the book of Joshua with the overthrow of the Canaanite city-states and the subjugation of their peoples. And in some cases, God violently asking for these people to be overthrown for their many crimes. Now, a moral question is introduced in the mind of Gary Anderson. On one hand, God is the liberator of the oppressed. The Israelites were slaves in Egypt. They were under the yoke of bondage. And yet at the same time, here they are morally being presented as the subjugators, the conquerors, those who are engaging in dispersing the peoples of the land. How is Israel's nationhood to be understood in this context? Well, in the mind of Gary Anderson, there is an interesting example that doesn't begin with Joshua at all, that doesn't start at all with the conquest, but much earlier, back to Abraham. He turns to Genesis 15, and he does quote briefly from Genesis chapter 12, in which it's very clear that God's giving of the land over to the people of Israel, to the people of God, is contingent on their keeping of the covenant of God. And therefore, while their identity is deeply tied to a supernatural link with the land, a social connection with the land, it is also tied to the idea as well of covenant and terms that we've earlier discussed in previous recordings here of divine election. And so that when Israel eventually, inevitably, breaks commandments, like the Canaanites, and loses the land and is taken into captivity under King Nebuchadnezzar in the 500s BC, 500s BC. And when later on, he doesn't mention this to my knowledge, when the people of God, when the Jewish people are thrown out after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, so too their Jewish identity is maintained, it is preserved, because their identity is bound up with their covenantal belief that while they are deeply tied to the land, and they are tied to the land in a unique and blessed way, At the same time, the miracle of the Jewish people, as we find in a little anecdote given by Gary Anderson, is that if you go to New York or New Orleans, we don't find it shocking that we should find a modern Jewish person. And yet we don't see a modern day Canaanite or Hittite running around. We won't find necessarily an ancient Egyptian running around. We won't find necessarily these cultures referred to in the Bible, but the Jewish people still exist. And this is a testament, in Gary Anderson's mind, to this uniquely covenantal relationship. And it's one that he explicates in some detail, but he begins by trying to debunk what is the current archaeological understanding of the origin story of the conquest. So that is the Israel's biblical presentation of their nationhood. What about modern conceptions? Does this fit with modern conceptions? And in the archaeological world, the answer that Gary Anderson gives is a resounding no. That instead, archaeologically, he claims that there is absolutely no evidence for the conquest. He says, archaeologists can't distinguish between ancient Canaanites and between ancient Israelites. So what this means is if you dug up an ancient Israelite city and an ancient Canaanite city, they would appear to be supposedly synonymous. To my knowledge, he doesn't quote him, but this is definitely the thesis of Israel Finkelstein and many others involved in so-called mainstream biblical archaeology. And yet at the same time, there's also two other difficulties of modern conceptions of the nationhood of Israel. Ancient Israel was a theocracy. God was at the center. The temple was at the center. And while there was vying tensions between the king and the priestly class, as we find in the prophetic voices in the Old Testament again and again, it was a culture that was dedicated covenantally to the God of Israel. While it is a highly contested statement, and while it appears nowhere, I believe, discussed in the article, the modern state of Israel isn't necessarily a state that mandates and enforces on the death penalty a mandatory belief in the God of the Old Testament. And in fact, most biblical scholars that you will find within the modern state of Israel will take a very progressive liberal view of the historicity of the Old Testament. You'll find, obviously, there's deep tensions between these religious communities, but you'll find Christians and Muslims living in the state of Israel. Obviously, with as I said, with deep contentiousness, but they do exist. So the modern state of Israel is not functioning with a Levitical high priesthood or a temple system or a monarchy. It's a very different conception entirely. So does this fit modern conceptions? I think that it is very difficult to map ancient comparisons onto modern situations. So Gary Anderson makes some comparisons early on, seemingly, along with writings from a figure named John J. Collins, who I read a lot in my work at Fordham, to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. This is somewhat problematic. I believe that we're dealing with history that is quite distinct and unique in a lot of different ways. Now, what do we mean, though, by the archaeological evidence being nil? You will find repeatedly here in the recordings I've provided my deep discomfiture, my profound discomfiture with blanket statements along the lines of, well, it is certain that these events never occurred. First and foremost, there is deep disagreement among archaeologists as to the timeline of the Exodus, whether you have an early Exodus in the 1400s BCE, or whether you have a late Exodus in the 12 or 1300s BCE. Tim Mahoney has done good work on this on a popular level. Bryant Wood, Scott Stripling on a more academic level. Depending on when you date the Exodus, some of these Canaanite city-states are occupied. Jericho, for example, was occupied if you hold to an earlier date of the Exodus in the 1400s BCE, according to Bryant Wood. Scott Stripling, the Texan archaeologist, as far as I'm aware, has discovered large amounts of kosher remains in and around Mount Ebal, one of the hills of cursing you'll find described in both the book of Joshua and outlined, I believe, in Deuteronomy from the top of my head. And while these findings certainly are highly contested in archaeological circles, let's just simply say that the archaeological world is messy. It is a messy world. We are dealing with events that are 3,000 years old. So to triumphalistically state, as Anderson does, that the events of the conquest simply never happened, while I am thoroughly aware that this is the supposed mainstream view of archaeologists in the field, it is something that I think we need to appear with much more caution. And certainly as a believer in the authority of the biblical text, it's something that I personally have a strong disagreement with. But I deeply admire, I think this is a good concluding note, I deeply, deeply admire the fact that Gary Anderson, nowhere in his article, What About the Canaanites, simply says, well, because the biblical text is complicated, we need to dismiss the Jewish people as somehow heinous in the text for casting out the Canaanites. He tries to situate their covenant keeping with their own prospect of being expelled from the land, that they are accountable, just as the Canaanites also are accountable before God. And from a pastoral level, it leads us also to say, we who have been perhaps somewhat comfortable in some of our circles in the Western world, perhaps we need to be more accountable to God as well. And in order to remain faithful by grace through faith, of course, to the covenant that we have received, so that we can receive the good gifts of the land that we have walked in. In this way, just as the Canaanites were thrust out for disobedience, the people of God were thrust out, but as we hear Anderson clearly state from the book of Romans, the election and call of God are irrevocable. And in that irrevocable sense of God's love, I think we have a lot of source of peace and strength as we continue to explore these matters. Definitely look forward to continuing to discuss why I believe in the historicity and accuracy of a lot of these texts and issues, and look forward to hearing from all of you soon. God bless.